Welcome to the Securecast, a podcast series where we explore the true nature of business integrity. I'm Henk Meijer, and together with Naeem Arif, I am hosting this podcast series for Securance Advisory, formerly known as Intercontrol.
We've both been active for over 25 years, implementing internal control systems. For about 25 years, we've been working together in risk management and compliance across almost every sector of society.
We're both keen to share our knowledge through this podcast.
Henk has a background in business administration and is responsible for the advisory business within the Securance Group.
Naeem has an internal audit background and is a consultant. He also lectures part-time in risk and auditing at the Hague University of Applied Sciences and Nine Road Business University.
Each time we'll cover a theme, with or without a guest.
This is our third podcast, and this time the theme is being in control. In the last podcast, we took an in-depth look at the phenomenon of organisation. Now we're going to look at and discuss what being in control actually entails.
And that's a logical next step as far as I'm concerned. Now that we've defined the system, the organisation, we can talk about the system's behaviour, namely how to steer and manage it. And so being in control is about the system's behaviour. We're going to explore the concept, review definitions, and some practical examples.
And some practical examples, of course. Well, let me just get straight to the point then, Naeem. What is the real relevance of the concept of being in control? Why do we find it so interesting?
Well, because it relates to the very essence of an organisation, which is achieving its goals. And the concept of being in control is all about having a reasonable degree of certainty that you as an organisation will achieve your goals. And the concept has two perspectives. You can look at it from two angles, namely the internal perspective, right? So the management perspective. Achieving goals, realising your strategy, that by definition lies in the future, right? So this relates to this is a future-oriented dimension of being in control. Right, I call that the prospective dimension. Exactly. It's related to, because yes, goals by definition lie in the future, and that's why you can't say for certain, which is why we always say a reasonable degree of certainty. And there's an important external perspective, which is that the board also has to be accountable to its stakeholders for whether they have been in control, right? So that's the retrospective perspective. In hindsight, as a board, you can be held accountable for that. The reason behind that is increasing regulation. The most recent example of that is the arrival of the VOR. Remember that acronym because you're going to be hearing a lot about it in the near future. We'll cover that.
I'm sure we'll cover that separately at some point.
Definitely. And it stands for Statement on Risk Management, the VOR.
There we have it. So it's a bit like ESG, which is also, of course, now coming to the fore. Where I always get the impression that in America they tend to focus a bit more on internal objectives, also aimed at the shareholders. And in Europe it's more about what the other stakeholders also consider important, so they're included more. Yes, you see that in America. It's a bit more focused on the former, although they are quite strict with their measures. If your annual accounts aren't in order, I believe, right?
Yes, well, there are actual prison sentences. If it turns out afterwards that the annual accounts are incorrect, the CFO can go to jail for 25 years. You know, there have already been arrests where people have been led away in handcuffs.
Wow.
No half measures, I would say.
Right. But anyway, on the other hand, let's say the environment often suffers as a result.
Yes. Yes, especially the current regime in America has little to do with being green. We could safely say that.
Definitely. Right. Okay. Back to the concept of being in control.
Yes. What does that basically mean is the question, isn't it?
Indeed.
And there are many definitions circulating in the literature. And if you put all those definitions side by side and look for a common denominator, you arrive at a few elements. And that is, it starts with the context of the organisation. That is to say, what is your mission? What is your role in the environment? What products, what services do you have? Is there a demand for them? The core values, how do you want to produce your product or service? How do you have, your license to operate, as we call it, right? Your reason for being. Well, from there, you've obviously set goals, which products, which markets, which growth targets, taking into account the dynamics in the environment. Your competitors, technology, new legislation. The whole context, of course, determines what goals you have and what is achievable. Then you have to set up your organization, tasks, responsibilities, authorities, set up your processes. Everyone needs to know what they're responsible for. And then you get to work, right? So you start serving customers and running your business, so to speak. And you have to check from time to time if things are going well. You have to evaluate, check, and adjust based on reliable management information. In short, reliable management information is an inherent part of being in control.
Yes?
And if you're now threatening to go off course, then you have to adjust. Those are some basic elements when it comes to the concept of being in control.
Okay. And in a general sense, those are all, you're absolutely right about all that. So they're things that you also teach in your courses. But in practice, I do see clearly different schools of thought, in the field. An accountant looks at this in a slightly different way to a business manager. An accountant wants the figures to be correct, whether you achieve your goal or not. And a business manager looks at it from a broader perspective.
Yes. Those are two important perspectives side by side. Starting with the accountant. Look, an accountant has a very simple legal duty to make a statement about the reliability of the annual accounts. That's also the reason for the profession's existence.
Well, when did it start? 1622 or something, the first time an annual account was prepared, I believe.
Yes, audited, right? So it all comes from the famous or infamous Pinkoff case in Rotterdam, 1895. That's where it all started. That was the very first case when the penny dropped for society. That it just can't be right for a director to prepare the annual accounts themselves. Compile the figures, and then just release them. That's a very high level of naivety. That was the reaction at the time, the public reaction.
What do you mean you don't trust me?
No, exactly, yes. The Pinkoff case is actually still covered in all accountancy courses, because that's basically the case from which the profession originated.
Exactly.
It's also no coincidence that the Rotterdam RA program is the oldest.
Because that's where it was based.
Pinkoff was from Rotterdam.
Okay, but he still went and audited someone from Amsterdam, right? Because the VOC was based in Amsterdam.
The VOC was in Amsterdam.
Ooh, so the rivalry goes back that far.
The VOC was quite a bit earlier, but in being. And by the way, a few words about Pinkoff for the connoisseurs. Pinkoff was also a very prominent figure in Rotterdam, who also helped make the port of Rotterdam great. He had the newer waterway constructed. So for Rotterdam as a city, he meant a great deal. He was also a lobbyist in The Hague for Rotterdam. It didn't end well for him, because thanks to this case, when the figures turned out to be wrong, he of course had to hide or flee. And the Holland-America line already existed back then.
So he must have taken that.
He took that one. In the end, he died in rather destitute circumstances in New York. Then he was forgotten for 80 years. And about 10 years ago, Rotterdam restored his honour. The street was named after him because he also did a lot of good for Rotterdam. Besides the case.
Instead of just taking down statues, they're now putting a few up.
There's a bust of him in the port of Rotterdam, and a street has been named after him. So his honour's been restored a little. Back to our in control.
Yes, you were, I believe, about to say something about the traditional approach.
Yes, well, that means that the organisation is able to guarantee the completeness of its turnover to establish it. Is our turnover actually correct? A very basic question. And are the costs correctly accounted for? And are the assets protected, and is there no fraud? And so on. So that's what we call. These elements are known as the traditional approach to internal control. So everything related to finance, financial controls, is the financial information correct at all?
And then we also quickly get on to Strikwerda, don't we, from an accountant's perspective?
Yes, Strikwerda devised a model that helps us to establish the completeness of revenue and the correctness of the costs. A famous book from the 60s, which generations of accountants have
with the typologies.
with the typologies indeed.
But didn't you sort of half work for Staravel? Or was that one hand shake away, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, that's a nice anecdote indeed. One of my mentors, Arie Molenkamp, the founding father of internal audit education in the Netherlands, I had the privilege of working with him, of publishing with him. The man is 86, still going strong. Right, but in his younger years, he worked under Staravel at one of the legal predecessors of the current KPMG. It was called Crayonauthento, and yes,
So that's where the K comes from.
that's where that K comes from Crayonos. Yes, and Arie was in his early 20s then, and yes, Starreveld was already Mr. Starreveld back then. He told me I never addressed him by his first name. It was always Mr. Starveld in those days.
There you go.
He also, as a young pup, co-wrote his first book. You know, so what Starreveld did was he had people under him write about different typologies. You know, so, right, that team is in the production sector, you do a chapter on production companies. You're heavily involved in services, you do a chapter on services. And so Starreveld, or rather Arie Molenkamp, indeed co-wrote the first edition of his book.
But isn't it the case that Starreveld, yes, the accountants, of course, completely embraced him and started working from the typologies?
Yes.
But Starreveld himself, of course, wasn't specifically focused only on accountancy, was he? So he did have a broader view as well.
He held the title RA, you know, so he was a registered accountant. But in his thinking, in his books and in his philosophy, he was much broader than just the annual accounts. You know, so he really thought it was, if I can believe and quote Arie Molenkamp, he was a business expert. In Annie's words, he was an organisation man.
There you go.
And not so much an annual accounts man. Only that's unfortunately what he's known for by many people, because his philosophy regarding financial control came in very handy for accountants when auditing the annual accounts.
Exactly.
And that's the reason he has a prominent place in accountancy training still. For that time, I can safely say that he came up with the egg of Columbus. You have to imagine we had no anchor points to establish the completeness of revenue. Just imagine how basic a question can be. How does management know that we've captured all the revenue and that nothing is slipping through the cracks?
Still not an easy question.
No, but he came up with a systematic answer to it. Yes.
Very good. And actually, he is, of course, a bit from the old school. How should I put it? It's been a while since his heyday. But if you were to translate him to the current environment, he would undoubtedly have become an IT specialist. Yes, he was. Automation, he thought that was absolutely fantastic.
Yes, I am a bit warped, to be honest. Professionally warped, as you know, Henk.
No, never noticed a thing.
I looked up his inaugural lecture. He became a professor at the University of Amsterdam in 1959.
I didn't even exist back then.
And when you become a professor, you give a speech. That's called an oration. And I once looked up that oration. It's just available on the internet. And if you read it, yes, it's rather archaic Dutch. But if you read it carefully, it's actually one big plea for IT. Of course, he uses the vocabulary of the time, automated data processing. But I think if you really read between the lines of his oration, and if he were alive today, he'd be an IT guy.
Yes, well, exactly. Everything you can automate, you should just try to automate as much as possible. In fact,
current ERP systems are based on his ideas.
Yes, good stuff. Yes, well, yes, right. If you, say, take all the elements you just mentioned, a bit broader as well, legal framework, IT, cyber framework, safety, physical aspect, if you include all that, as you say, but things you want clarity and transparency about are, if you line it all up, they're actually all expressions of the concept of quality.
Yes. So just to be clear, we've just discussed the traditional approach. Opposite that is the broad or modern approach to internal control. And that's about, of course, the traditional approach remains the foundation, because the turnover has to be correct. That's still the basis. And the costs have to be correct. So financial control remains the core, but on top of that comes achieving goals with people. So everything related to it: behavior, culture, steering behavior, IT, cyber. There you go. Then you're talking about the broad approach to being in control. So that's always processes, systems, people. The three components of modern business operations, especially the human component. You can see that in recent decades, attention to this has also increased in the literature. So there are all sorts of new insights in the field of managing people's behavior. Because in the end, it's still all about people. Internal control is people work.
I often switch as well.
And people do tend to say yes and do no yes. People have a tendency to work around the roles.
People tend not to want to admit it when something has gone wrong.
In other words, when it comes to managing behavior, these are the issues you have to deal with. Yes, unfortunately, in recent years, all sorts of new insights have emerged in the field that help with this.
Good. Right. Well, yes, all right. A broader understanding of quality. By the way, I always find it so interesting. You've mentioned it a few times already, that reasonable degree of certainty. Especially from the accountant's perspective, of course, it's an important element when you're auditing financial statements. It is the highest level when it comes to approving financial statements, but also for assurance reports. Absolutely. So it comes down to this. Even if you have all the information, you still can't offer certainty. How does that work?
Well, my personal opinion is that the term certainty, the term exists, but the phenomenon itself does not. Certainty doesn't exist.
No one is 100% certain.
No, nothing in life is certain.
Except that you'll die and pay taxes.
Those are two anchor points in life indeed. But apart from that, of course, there is little certainty in life. So I think, even in politics, the term certainty is used left, right and centre.
It's unbelievable.
Also, the term existential security, which was a central theme in the last elections. Whereas I think, professionally speaking, what actually is certainty? So an employer is expected to provide certainty to people while the entrepreneur themselves has no form of certainty whatsoever as an entrepreneur.
Yes, that's called taking risks. Exactly. Entrepreneurship.
So that regularity of certainty has everything to do with the fact that firstly, humans are fallible and can make mistakes, both unintentionally and intentionally. And a second important aspect, the costs of being in control can increase enormously. So that's why you always have to weigh up which measures you're going to take. And at what point do those measures themselves become more expensive than the objective? So when do you decide to just accept it? So those two aspects, cost of control and human safety, mean that at best you can talk about reasonable measures of certainty.
Yes, it's always a bit about trying to prevent that. Or prevent, well, you never know for sure if there are still skeletons in the closet. Well,
yes, you can never be completely certain, because there are always things that can happen which you hadn't thought of beforehand. Let me give you an example. Last year, I read that a commercial flight was safely landed primarily by the highly skilled co-pilot because the pilot had a sudden and severe heart attack during the flight.
it can happen.
Exactly. So that co-pilot is definitely not redundant. In the literature, we call that redundancy. That means you implement a control measure twice. Very expensive, isn't it? Yes, definitely. It really is very expensive. So you only do it in a really important. Well, this is one of those cases. In other words, something can always happen that you haven't. Sarsos.
No, plus that. But anyway, then we're getting into a slightly different element. How much money are you willing to spend to avoid certain risks? Taking. So if your data center gets hit by a Boeing, your data's gone as well. So you still want a backup. Well, that's very expensive. Definitely. Okay, then yes, I want to say something about a reasonable degree of certainty. Of course, it's a bit of a cover your ass clause. That's the worst, of course, but understandable. Yes, exactly. And the takeaway? Here, that is a reasonable degree of certainty. So in the audit and in accounting. Truly, the highest level is what you can achieve. Sure. Okay.
What's also good to say, that you can use the concept of in control at different levels and aggregation levels. You can talk about the highest level is organization. Is the company in control? Is it going to achieve its goals? Then you can talk about a business unit or a division level. That can also be in control or not. Then you can talk about a process, a business process that is in control or not. A project can also be in control or not. In other words, at every level of aggregation where and whether, you can use this concept. Are you as a person in control? We sometimes ask, are you in control? I once asked Lean Papin, one of my mentors, so Lean, how are things with you? He said, as far as I can see, as far as I'm aware, I think most things are in control. It's almost an in control statement.
Yes. Well, all right, what do I think? This is an important one. Some people also say that if you have everything under control, you're not going fast enough. That's the other side of it. But anyway, that's a matter of perspective. What I do think is important is that being in control, it's very important to be clear about the level and scope of your being in control. So the responsibility to be in control can only work when it aligns with your circle of influence. You can't be in control of something over which you have absolutely no influence, because that's definitely a recipe for burnout, both for individuals and for organizations. So you can hang yourself from the tallest trees if you want to, if you simply haven't set your goals properly, defined.
Absolutely. And I think burnout is quite a fitting metaphor, because burnout can happen on a personal level. But in a metaphorical sense, it can also occur at the organizational level. An organization can also experience burnout.
Absolutely. In some organizations, people are running around with steam coming out of their ears, nothing gets done, and everyone is dissatisfied. And also because the goals simply aren't being achieved.
Either.
Then COSO. I'd suggest we keep it a bit brief, the COSO story. Maybe we can discuss it separately another time.
Yes, perhaps we should dedicate a separate podcast to it. It's a very well-known model in certain circles. It's a model that comes from America. It also has a definition of being in control. We're mentioning it here because it's often cited and used in practice.
It's also very useful.
Yes, and there are different versions of COSO. And here we're discussing the 2013 version, and 2017 very briefly. 2013, because COSO 2013 basically says, when is a company in control? Very simply, if it is able in point 1 to deliver reliable annual results. If it has its processes under control, operations, just the primary and secondary processes are managed. And lastly, you have to comply with the law, compliance. So reporting, operations, and compliance. If you set objectives in those 3 areas and achieve them with a reasonable degree of certainty, then according to COSO, the organization is in control.
So that's the in control approach. Of course, you also have the ERM approach.
Yes, in 2004, the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Model was introduced. And that had a slightly different definition of being in control. In addition to the 3 elements I just mentioned, which still stand, strategy is added, achieving your objectives. So the difference between 2013 is much more about accountability. That's where the emphasis lies. Whereas with ERM, it's much more about steering and developing the organization. In addition to accountability, exactly, also much more.
Future-oriented.
Exactly.
Okay, and is that now because, yes, you have those 2 different versions? So you have the in-control version and the ERM version. Is that a sort of pissing contest? A contest between 2 different schools of thought?
Well, it might seem that way. Why have 2 of them? No, because the internal control version, so that's the 92 and 2013 versions, both of those are about internal control. Angel Sachs talk about internal control. But that's not internal control as we mean it in Dutch. That's something quite different. It's more about internal management control. And that concerns 3 objectives: operations, reporting, and compliance. And those models don't pay attention to steering and developing the organization. So determining the direction of the organization, that's not really included. But it is included in ERM.
Okay, but still ERM is basically just the broader version. So when they came up with ERM, why do they still keep that cube, the in-control version?
Well, they exist alongside each other. The COSO committee never says which model is best, which one you should drop, and which one you should use. It all depends on the maturity of the organization. The context, the sector, the requirements of the regulator, all those variables play a role. There are organisations that stick with 2013 because it's clear and it's a handy framework, and they stick with that. And there are organisations that use the ERM version because they also want to do something with the direction of the organisation and want to shape her strategy.
Okay, shall we mention Strikwerda briefly?
Yes, Professor Strikwerda, professor at Amsterdam. I once attended a seminar with him. Of course, it was all internal auditors at that seminar, all very focused on COSO. And he made a few remarks to put things into perspective, which have always stuck with me. He said being in control according to COSO, so that reliable reporting.
So that was the in control version. Yes.
Reliable reporting, having your processes in order, and complying with the law. He said, if you translate that to the medical world, that's the level where a patient is breathing, their heart is still beating, and their temperature is around 36 degrees. That's what he thinks. The level of being in control according to COSO 2013. The bare minimum of being in control. So I asked, what is your definition of being in control then? Then he said, in my view, being in control means that an organisation is adaptive given the changing circumstances.
Yes, do you want to survive or do you want to go extinct?
Do you want to be the ball or the player?
But wasn't the COSO committee, Anchi, also set up to move away a bit from that purely annual accounts perspective?
Yes, perhaps I can say something about that. Good question, because that goes back to 92 now. So when the first version came out in 92, the reason the then US Secretary of the Treasury set up this committee was that even at the end of the 1980s, organisations were collapsing that had an approved set of annual accounts.
Yes, annual accounts, fine, but patients were dying.
Exactly. Operation successful, patients dead. Because at that time, you see, the whole concept of being in control was simply do the annual accounts add up? Then you were considered in control. And that was the moment when it was like, yes, but hang on a minute, apparently being in control is about more than just having the accounts in order. And that was the reason, and COSO came up with a definition that indeed went a bit further than just having the accounts correct. Good.
Why?
Yes, because I want to hear from you, since you've been around for quite a while now, in helping organisations in supporting boards when it comes to being in control. What are your reflections from practice?
Well, yes. So, what I always find really fascinating is that there really are still people, though fortunately it's becoming less common, who think that if they declare they're in control, then they actually are in control. So that's what you call being in control. A statement for it. Those are usually drawn up very extensively. You really wonder, how can you sign something like this and still sleep at night? And they attach a great deal of value to it, especially the stacked in control statements. Because if the CEO has to issue a control statement in the annual report, then of course he will ask his managers below him, so are you in control? With all the bells and whistles attached. That whole layer underneath, of course, doesn't want to be called hell. So naturally, they all claim that everything is in order. So in that way, you create a sort of, I sometimes call it a golden manhole cover. So everything that's not right just stays beneath the surface. It doesn't get seen, and everything that is allowed to come out gets passed on. So everything is fine.
Yes, but what you actually mean is that each higher management layer bases itself on the statement from the layer below.
Exactly, and that those layers create a sort of fog for the top management when looking down. Actually, that's a bit of the reason why audit departments exist as well. Yes.
That's actually the reason.
To see through most of that, but just relying purely on these kinds of in-control statements, that's less than the bare minimum, I would say.
So?
That's done to pass a bit of responsibility downwards. But in practice, it just results in misinformation, as you've called it before as well. Watermelon, green outside, red inside.
Exactly.
That's
in
no one's interest. No, that's in no one's interest. The organisation doesn't benefit from it. I've literally had someone say to me once, I thought that was quite something. They said, we are in control. Because as an organisation, we're so good at solving problems. So if there's a problem, we just solve it. Yes.
So if there's a little fire, we put it out. And we're good at that.
Then we're in control. Yes, it's great, isn't it? But all jokes aside, what we actually encounter in practice and what things look like on the shop floor is that you first need to be very clear about who you are and what you do. So make sure you know what your mission is, that you have a strategy, and that your organization is clear. So if you have 5 or 20 people in an organization, you can still keep a pretty good overview. But if it gets bigger, then you do need a bit of a tool to make sure that everything you think is actually correct, or to be sure you know how it works. How do the processes run? What kind of frameworks have you set for everything? How are the objectives progressing? They're process level, and only then can you move on to the question of, oh, what could actually go wrong? So then you start defining risks. They always exist in relation to an objective. Yes, I always say, without an objective, there are no risks. Exactly. And then you ask yourself the question, how are we going to keep this under control? So then you set up controls, measures, checks and balances. You can set this up at all sorts of levels, across all areas within the organization. That's too much for now, but we'll definitely come back to discuss that another time. But then the final question is, yes, it's all well and good that I've put all these measures in place, but how can I be sure that it actually works? So how can I objectively test this? So our position, and my position as well, is that you are only truly in control when you can determine for yourself that you are in control.
But by yourself, you mean the management?
Yes, exactly. As an organization, you need to have an objective, demonstrable reporting line that shows you whether you are actually in control. So whether the measures you've taken are actually working. So that's an important takeaway. So if you can't measure for yourself that you're in control, then yes, then it becomes very difficult to be able to claim that. And that's not the case, which I also come across regularly, that people say, yes, we are in control, because every year the auditor comes to confirm that things are running smoothly here. So yes, we are completely in control.
Yes, so it's important that management itself has the tools to determine that they are in control, and that you shouldn't have to rely on hearing that from someone else. From an outsider. It's called
internal control, not external control.
Exactly. And that's sometimes forgotten. In short, make sure there is transparency, openness, and a culture of learning. Learn from mistakes. There also needs to be room to make them, because otherwise you end up with those watered-down reports. So that psychological safety is an extremely important element in the organization. So as a leader, you need to organize dissent. And that dissent, that's easy to say, but I mean something very concrete by it. Make sure there are checks and balances in the form of a second line, risk managers or internal auditors who occasionally offer a different perspective, who expose another blind spot. So yes, organise your dissent. And there's a model for that as well, which we'll cover next time. 3 lines model.
3 lines of defence. It used to be, now it's 3 lines.
Exactly. We'll also cover that history. Yeah, cool, man. I'm looking forward to it, though. That model's actually about, how do I organise mal? Contradiction. That's actually one off there. How do I create objectivity? Exactly.
That's a very important one. Good. I think we're getting to the end of this podcast. Do you have any sort of takeaway for the people? Yes.
I would say stay alert to changing internal and external circumstances. Avoid tunnel vision. Make sure you can objectively determine that you are in control, that you achieve your goals. And yes, avoid those watered down reports, because no one benefits from them.
Exactly. Well, Brunman. And if we're lucky, we'll even bag plea as well. Exactly. And Starveld. Thanks, everyone. If you have any questions, let us know. Are you curious about our next Securecast? Then listen to it via our profiles on LinkedIn, Spotify, YouTube, and of course the Securance website. So for now,
thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you at the next Securecast.
See you next time. Bye.